Good morning, colleagues. Welcome to the first meeting of 2013 of the Referendum-Scotland-Bill Committee. Can I just check everyone's mobile phones are switched off, etc. We have apologies from Annabel Goldie, who is being replaced today by John Lamont, and from Linda Fabiani and Bill Kidd as the substitute for Linda. I don't think there are any other apologies because the deputy is here. And that takes us to item 1 on the agenda, which is our work programme, and that provides the committee with an opportunity to consider the timetable for the scrutiny of the two forthcoming bills, both the Franchise Bill and the Referendum Bill itself. The paper sets out potential timetable for both bills. It's not mentioned in the paper, but of course both of these bills will need to go both to the Sub-Leg Committee if there's any secondary legislation in any of the bills, and to the Finance Committee for their consideration. They'll need to feed in and fit round our timetable, whatever we agree. There are timetables at the back of the paper provided by the clerks, showing how we could work these in two separate columns for the Franchise Bill and the Referendum Bill, but two options for the Referendum Bill, depending on what approach we want to take. And really the purpose of today is just to invite members to give any comment they might have, particularly on the two options and which ones they would prefer. We don't particularly need to come to a decision on this today, but I think it might be helpful guidance for the clerks if we've got an idea of where the committee were. So, over to you folks. Who wants to kick off the discussion? James.
Thanks a lot, Convener. A couple of points on the timetable itself. Obviously, there are two bills before us here, the Franchise Bill and the Referendum Bill. Franchise Bill, as proposed, is on a curtailed timetable, and the Referendum Bill is certainly on a shorter timetable than you would expect for such a substantive piece of legislation. In studying the information that's been provided by the Deputy First Minister, although initially I certainly had concerns about the curtailed timetable for the paving legislation, I can see the logic in it, in that that legislation is required prior to the winter canvass, and the winter canvass commences in August 2013, and obviously the legislation as proposed needs to be completed by the end of June, so I can understand the logic in that. Clearly there might be a number of substantive practical issues around how data is collected and how we get 16 and 17-year-olds onto the register. And the only comment I would put down is that perhaps we might need to consider, as we begin to take evidence, if it's more complex than we think, have the reservation that we take further evidence if required. In terms of although I see the logic in all that for the paving legislation, in terms of the Referendum Bill, I can't see the kind of timeline for October 2013. I'm not saying that that's not the correct timeline, but it's not been laid out as to why it needs to be then. Why not December 2013 or into the following year? I'm not saying that, I'm not arguing for that, but I'm just saying that whereas in contrast to the paving legislation, there's been a clear logic laid out as to why that timetable has been put in place. And I don't see that for the Referendum Bill itself, and I would like to see a proper timeline, before agreeing to the timetable before us.
Okay, any other comments? Rob?
I think it's useful to hear that the paving bill is something that does have to be in place, I think, by June, and it won't be the first time in this Parliament that we've had bills taking anything around 16 weeks. There's quite a number of examples of these from earlier sessions. So I think that the competence of this committee to handle any extra evidence coming up can be dealt with in that time, and I would hope that it was possible for us to scope that out in the committee with a view to thinking about where there might be hitches. But it's a 10-page at the most bill, 6 pages of actual bill. It's not a huge piece of legislation, so I would have thought that there's every good reason why the paving bill should be able to be carried out on time.
Tavish.
Thank I think that's a fair point that Mr Gibson makes in respect to the paving bill. But I think he would also presumably also say this is not just any other bill. These are two pretty, by any standards, pretty unique pieces of legislation, indeed the most unique pieces of legislation this Parliament will ever. I know you shouldn't use the word unique about legislation because every minister argues his legislation is the most unique yet, but this is pretty different from anything else we'll ever consider. So I think we should take it in that spirit. So fair enough on the paving legislation. I think James Kelly makes a fair point on the referendum-bill. I mean, if there is, to coin a phrase, a stooshy over the Electoral Commission advice, we'll need more time. And I think we should be mindful of that and therefore build in some flexibility to that now, so as not to have the committee force its hand. I can't imagine anything worse than a parliamentary committee dealing with this kind of legislation being accused of hurrying it through in whatever way. So that may not happen. It may all be very easy. It may all be sweetness and light. I have meetings, so I think there needs to be some understanding that were there to be some challenges in terms of aspects of this measure, we may need time for that.
Patrick.
I take the point that sometimes things don't go as planned, and there might be events or disagreements that mean that the timescale slips. But I think October is probably a reasonable period to aim at. I mean, I do think, although this is, as Tavish says, a unique situation, a unique piece of legislation, what we should all want out of this process is to agree the rules, agree the legislation for the referendum, and then allow not just Parliament but the whole of Scotland to get on and debate the wider issue instead of the legislation to set the referendum. And I think moving it into the new year would be very regrettable. Obviously, if some slippage is necessary, then we should be in control of that timetable and not be forced or rushed into it. But I think October would be a reasonable time to aim at, and I think it's achievable.
Stuart.
Thanks, Convener. I agree with James and others about the franchise bill. It makes perfect sense, effectively, to complete by the end of June. On the referendum bill itself, I agree with Patrick. I think the issue here is the timetable is reasonable. However, if something comes up that causes us to then have to push it back or add additional sessions in, we can do that. We can certainly request that some of the dates are pushed back. So I don't think we should plan to, have an expectation that we will take longer than this. It may well happen. I hope it doesn't. But if it does, then we can deal with that as we go along, rather than put a further timetable in, which is longer than the one suggested in the paper. So I would say we can probably, hopefully, agree with the suggestions here, and I would probably go for option one in the referendum bill. If we're discussing that just now, I don't think there's any problem with that. If we need extra time, I think we certainly can meet earlier than 10 o'clock. I don't think there's any problem with that, rather than adding extra weeks. But if we do need to add extra weeks, well, we can deal with that at the point that we come to that.
Annabelle.
Thanks, Convener. Yes, I would agree with Stuart's point about starting earlier, because I understand that there is precedent for that in the Parliament, and some committees do start earlier where they need to. And I think probably that's preferable to, if there's an option seeking extra days. So in terms of option one, I think I too prefer option one, but with the possibility of starting earlier, or perhaps even starting after parliamentary business. I don't know how that works as a relatively new member, but it seems to me to be sensible to make more use of the business hours of the day, which most people start early anyway. One point I would make, just for clarification, on the draft programme as it stands, it seems to me that this proposed session on Thursday, 7th February, has maybe not been included in this draft, whereas it is on the previous page 4. So it perhaps is to be added back in, the 7th of February. It's a typo. And lastly, I would just say, option one with the flexibility to certainly have a session starting earlier, perhaps look at additional sessions as necessary. I think what we have to do, this is a piece of legislation, it's a procedural in its content, and I think obviously the issues about substance are ones that we all have very strong views about and will lead to much debate, but the issues of process are essentially issues of process and very important issues that they are, You know, I think that this timetable is not without precedent, so I think it fits within the normal work of this Parliament since its reconvening in 1999.
John and then Stuart.
And thank you, Convener. I mean, I share James's analysis in terms of the franchise bill. In terms of the timing for the referendum bill, I mean, if there are timing issues which can't be dealt with through having extra sessions or meeting earlier, how easy is it to push the date back? So if we agree the planning timetable as set out in this paper, and we discover once we get started, or once the committee gets started, that there are issues which are going to need longer to be resolved, and how easy is it to adapt the timetable to accommodate that?
The other thing we would need to do as a committee would seek the approval of the Bureau to slip timescales back. That would be a requirement of us to do that. But that's a technical possibility. Stuart?
Thank you, Convener. Just two very brief points. The first one regarding the franchise bill. I think the comments that have been aired so far, and I concur with. But secondly, regarding the actual referendum bill, I think there's something that we as a committee have really got to fully pay attention to as well, and that is the general public and the electorate. Because I think thus far, many of the messages that have actually been aired have been fairly consistent in terms of what we as a committee have been saying. But also there have been times where there have been calls for the referendum to actually happen sooner rather than later. And for we as a committee, if we today decide to actually try to delay the proceedings or can extend the proceedings, then that might actually create some confusion for the electorate. And they might be wondering, well, on the one hand, some people are actually calling for an early referendum, but on the other hand, this committee of the Parliament are actually asking for more time. So the one thing I would suggest would be to work along whichever option that we decide today, to work along that. Then certainly if we do require additional time further down the line, further down the process, then go through the proper parliamentary procedures to ask for that. But I don't think we as a committee should actually be asking for additional time today.
Sure.
Convener, I think it's clear that we have a consensus as far as the franchise bill is concerned, and that's possibly something we now put to the side. However, I would go back to the original point that James Kelly made, and that is that, in effect, Parliament has a way of dealing with legislation. It has a set time frame to which committees should and usually do work. And if there is going to be an abbreviation of that time frame, then good reasons should be given. Now, so far, we haven't been given any explanation as to why a curtailed time frame is needed for this particular piece of legislation. Therefore, it seems to me to be slightly strange that we're talking about it the other way round. We're talking about it in the sense that if we then find we need more time, we go and ask for it, when in actual fact, we're entitled to have it in the first instance. So unless there's actually a reason why that we haven't been given, that this bill should actually be taken in this curtailed time frame, I don't really see what the problem is. And I think actually the people of Scotland want us to come up with a robust piece of legislation within the framework of the Parliament, and that's what we're tasked with doing. I think if we do anything else, that's when we'd be failing the people of Scotland.
Okay, can I try and... I realise there are diverging views here, but try to get a way that everyone can agree that we can take this forward. I tend to the optimistic perspective in life anyway, normally, in terms of how we might see an outcome, a positive view about where we might be, and try to look on everything I do in that light. But James makes a reasonable point in terms of the paragraph from the Deputy First Minister doesn't really give a detail about why that October deadline is required. Now, there may be issues out there, particularly to do with the Gould recommendations, that for technical reasons certain things need to be done by a certain date, but we don't know that. And Gould certainly required all legislation to be in place 6 months before the poll. But what I don't know at this stage, and none of us know, is how much secondary legislation will be involved in the referendum bill. So I think that what we should do is go back and ask more information of the Deputy First Minister about, why is that October deadline so important, and in these circumstances, wait till we get a response to nail their colours to the mast on their timetable for the option that we go for in terms of the referendum bill. But in terms of if we're convinced that when the Deputy First Minister replies to us that there's a good rationale for that date, can I suggest from what I've heard that we opt for the option 1 stream, just to help the clerks in terms of their planning, rather than the option 2 stream. Is that reasonable?
Just on option 1, I'm not too comfortable with option 1, not least of which because what you're proposing in terms of the Chamber is a stage 3 proceedings on Tuesday the 25th and possibly Thursday the 27th, and also a stage 1 debate on the main bill on the same day, on the Thursday. So in the final week of Parliament, before the summer recess, you are asking for a whacking great week of debating just the Constitution. And now, you and I both, you more recently than I, but we'll both remember what the last week of Parliament's like in ministerial terms. There are plenty of other things going on, and I would be very surprised if there wouldn't be a difficulty in timetabling 2 massive pieces of very important legislation in the final week of Parliament before the summer recess, when everything else in government's going on. And I also don't think it's advisable to have those 2 pieces of legislation dealt with in the final week. I think there's a very good argument that's for that, as option 2 has it, for stage 1 of the debate on the main bill to be, or the referendum bill to be the first week back after the summer recess.
So I'm entirely relaxed whichever we use. That was the views I was
So I'd rather
hearing.
prefer option 2.
Okay, Rob.
Well, I was merely going to say that thinking about the last weeks and with third stages and so on coming up, it's usually been the case that Tuesday mornings and Tuesday mornings now, but Wednesday mornings have been taken up as well as afternoons. So in fact, the week has been extended in order to accommodate that legislation. So there is a possibility of doing it, and it's a matter of asking the business managers to make sure that we timetable things to make that happen, if they consider it that important.
Yeah, I would agree with Rob's comments, and I mean, a stage 1 debate is quite different from a stage 3 debate.
James.
In terms of your own suggestion, convener, for the way forward, I think that's entirely reasonable. I wasn't, arguing that we should necessarily extend the timetable. I simply wanted more information as to why the timetable that was been proposed, what the backup reasons for that were. I think Tavish makes a fair point. My memory of the final weeks, the final week of Parliament is usually it's pretty packed. The government are usually trying to get other stage 3s through, and I think trying to put both of these debates in the final week. I know Annabelle's saying it's only a stage 1, but this is going to have there's going to be a lot of focus and profile around it. And I think as a Parliament, it's important that we get the scheduling of that right. And from that point of view, it would be better if that stage 1 debate was after the summer recess.
It's good to get people's initial views, because that's what we're trying to do today. So let's agree on the franchise bill timetable. Let's go right to the Deputy First Minister, find out what the parameters that the government are working around, whether there are any technical reasons for the October deadline, and then we can come back and look at the timetable for the referendum bill itself, because that'll, if we're being told that actually there are no particular reasons for the end of October, then it makes it a bit easier to decide the timetable. So let's do it in that order. Is that reasonable? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. In that case, we now, in the second item on the agenda, we already agreed that we would go into private at a previous meeting. We are now, can ask any members who are not supposed to be here, or any members of the public, now they can go.